On November 3, 1954, Chicago Police Department detectives executing a warrant at St. Adalbert's Rectory found something that would haunt them for the rest of their careers. Behind a false panel in the basement chapel, they discovered a small room, no more than 6 feet square. The air inside tasted like gun oil and frankincense. On a wooden table sat a leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with dates, names, and dollar amounts. Beside each entry, written in careful script, was a single Latin phrase: Requiescat in pace. Rest in peace. Beneath the ledger, wrapped in white linen like a burial shroud, they found 17 handguns. Each weapon had been meticulously cleaned and oiled, and on the barrel of every gun, etched in delicate script, was a blessing in Latin. The same blessing used for the anointing of the sick. The detectives stood in that cramped room for a long time, not speaking. One of them, a man named Patrick Corrigan, who'd been raised Catholic and still attended Mass every Sunday, would later tell a reporter that he felt like he'd walked into a place where the laws of God and the laws of man had been deliberately, methodically inverted, where someone had taken the most sacred rituals of his faith and weaponized them, literally. The ledger contained 43 entries spanning 7 years, 43 names, 43 deaths, and beside each one, that same phrase: Requiescat in pace. As if the killing had been a sacrament, as if murder had been transformed into prayer. This is not a story about a criminal who used religion as camouflage. This is not a story about corruption in the church, though there was corruption. This is a story about what happens when faith becomes so absolute that it erases the boundary between righteousness and atrocity. This is a story about a woman who believed, with every fiber of her being, that she was doing God's work, and about the men who let her believe it because her belief made them untouchable. This is the story of Sister Mary Benedetta, the nun who blessed the bullets before every hit. Before we continue, I want you to do something for me. If you're finding this story compelling, make sure to hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Which city? Which state? I want to know where this story is reaching. Because what happened in Chicago in the 1950s, the machinery of belief that allowed it to happen, that machinery is still running. Still converting faith into violence. Still convincing people that cruelty can be holy if you just frame it correctly. Now, back to that basement room. Back to those blessed guns. To understand how a Catholic nun came to sanctify murder, we must go back. Not to Chicago, but to a village in Sicily called Corleone in the winter of 1919. We must go back to a girl named Benedetta Russo, born during an earthquake that killed 47 people and left the village church standing untouched. Her mother, bleeding and terrified in the wreckage of their home, made a vow. If the child survived, she would give her to God. Benedetta grew up in the shadow of that vow. While other girls learned to cook and sew and prepare for marriage, she learned prayers. While they played in the streets, she knelt in the church, her knees going numb on the stone floor, her lips moving in silent devotion. By the time she was 12, she could recite the entire rosary from memory. By 14, she was teaching catechism to younger children. By 16, she had announced her intention to take vows. But this was Sicily in the 1930s. This was a place where the church and the mafia were not separate institutions, but intertwined roots of the same ancient tree. Where priests heard confessions from men who controlled entire towns through violence, and those same men donated generously to build new chapels, new schools, new orphanages. Where the line between spiritual authority and temporal power had been blurred for so long that no one could say where one ended and the other began. Benedetta's uncle was a man named Salvatore Russo. In the village, he was known as a businessman. He owned olive groves and a small export company. But the young men who worked for him didn't spend their days picking olives. They spent them collecting debts, settling disputes, and occasionally making people disappear. Salvatore was a capo in the Corleone family, one of the most powerful mafia clans in Sicily. And when Benedetta announced her intention to become a nun, it was Salvatore who made the arrangements. He didn't send her to a local convent. He sent her to Rome, to an order called the Sisters of Perpetual Mercy, an order known for its work with the poor and the sick, an order that, not coincidentally, had been generously funded by men like Salvatore for generations, an order that understood the value of discretion. Benedetta arrived in Rome in the spring of 1937. She was 18 years old, thin as a rail, with dark eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. The Mother Superior, a woman named Sister Agatha, who'd been running the convent for 30 years, recognized something in her immediately. Not piety, exactly. Piety was common. What Benedetta had was certainty, an absolute, unshakable conviction that she knew God's will, that she could hear His voice in the silence of her prayers. Sister Agatha had seen this before. She'd seen young women arrive burning with faith, convinced they were chosen, special instruments of divine purpose. Most of them, the fire burned out. They learned humility. They learned doubt. They learned that God's voice was quieter and stranger than they'd imagined, but not Benedetta. For 6 years, she lived in the convent. She took her vows. She worked in the hospital the sisters ran, tending to the sick and the dying. She was good at it. Patients found her presence comforting. She had a way of making death seem less frightening, of framing it as a transition rather than an ending. She would sit beside dying men and women, holding their hands, whispering prayers, anointing them with holy oil. And when they died, she would close their eyes and say, with absolute conviction, "Requiescat in pace." Rest in peace, as if she had the authority to grant it. The war came. Rome was occupied, then liberated. The convent became a refuge for displaced people, for wounded soldiers, for anyone who needed sanctuary. And through it all, Benedetta worked, tirelessly, without complaint. She seemed to need less sleep than other people, less food, less rest. She was, Sister Agatha noted in her private journal, either a saint or something else entirely. In 1943, a man arrived at the convent. His name was Domenico Lanza, though he gave a false name at the door. He'd been shot twice, once in the shoulder and once in the abdomen. He was bleeding heavily, delirious with fever. The sisters took him in, as they took in everyone, and it was Benedetta who tended to him. She cleaned his wounds. She stitched the torn flesh. She sat beside him through the long nights when the fever raged, pressing cool cloths to his forehead, whispering prayers. And when he finally woke, weak but alive, the first thing he saw was her face. Dark eyes, calm expression, the faint smell of incense and carbolic soap. He asked her if he was dead, if she was an angel. She smiled, a rare thing, and she said, "Not yet," and no. Domenico Lanza was not a soldier. He was a soldato in the Corleone family, the same family Benedetta's uncle served. He'd been shot during a dispute over territory, over tribute, over the 1,000 petty reasons men killed each other in those years. He'd crawled to the convent because he knew the sisters would take him in, because he knew they wouldn't ask questions. He stayed for 3 weeks while his wounds healed, and during those 3 weeks, he and Benedetta talked. Late at night, when the other sisters were asleep, she would sit beside his bed and they would speak in low voices. He told her about his life, about the family, about the code they lived by, the omerta, the silence that bound them together, about the violence that was not chaos but structure, not sin but duty. And she listened, not with horror, not with judgment, but with something that disturbed him more: understanding. She told him about her uncle, about growing up in Corleone, in the shadow of the family, about the vow her mother had made, the vow that had given her to God. And then she said something that Domenico would remember for the rest of his life. She said, God works through all things, even violence, even death. The Church has always known this. The Crusades, the Inquisition. The sword and the cross are not opposites. They are partners. One enforces the will of heaven, the other sanctifies it. Domenico stared at her, this small woman in a nun's habit, her hands folded in her lap, her voice calm and certain. And he realized she wasn't horrified by what he was. She was interested. She saw his world not as a corruption of faith, but as an expression of it. When he left the convent, he carried a letter. Benedetta had written it herself, sealed it with wax, and pressed it into his hand. She told him to deliver it to her uncle in Sicily. She told him it was time for her to come home. The letter was brief. Domenico never read it, but years later, after everything that followed, investigators would find a copy in Salvatore Russo's personal papers. It said, "I have learned what I needed to learn. I am ready to serve." In the spring of 1946, Benedetta returned to Sicily, but she didn't return to the village. She went to Palermo to a convent there, one that Salvatore had helped establish. It was called the Convent of the Sacred Heart, and it served a very specific function. It was a place where the wives and daughters and sisters of mafiosi could retreat, a place where they could pray for the souls of men who lived by violence, a place where the church and the family could meet in quiet rooms and make arrangements that benefited both. Benedetta became the convent's liaison, the woman who sat in the parlor and received visitors, the woman who listened to confessions that weren't quite confessions, the woman who, when a man came seeking spiritual counsel, could offer something more practical than prayer. She developed a reputation. Men who were planning something dangerous, something that required absolute commitment, would come to her. They would kneel in the chapel. They would confess their intentions, and she would listen. And then, if she judged their cause righteous, if she believed they were acting in accordance with a higher order, she would bless them. Not with words, with ritual. She would take their weapons, their guns, their knives, and she would anoint them with holy oil. She would recite prayers over them, the same prayers used for the sick and the dying. And she would tell these men that what they were about to do was not murder. It was correction. It was the enforcement of divine order in a fallen world. The men believed her. How could they not? She was a nun, a bride of Christ. Her authority came not from the family, but from God himself. And if God, through her, sanctioned their actions, then they were not criminals. They were crusaders. This went on for years, quietly, carefully. Benedetta never asked for money. She never demanded tribute. She asked only that the men who came to her live by a code, that they kill only when necessary, that they avoid harming women and children, that they give generously to the church, that they confess their sins and seek absolution. She was, in her own mind, maintaining order. She was sanctifying violence so that it didn't become chaos. She was transforming murder into sacrament. And then, in 1950, everything changed. The Corleone family was expanding. They'd consolidated power in Sicily, and now they were looking west. to America, to cities like New York, like Detroit, like Chicago. Cities where Sicilian immigrants had already established footholds, where the old ways could be transplanted and adapted to new soil. Salvatore Russo was too old to make the journey himself, but his son, a man named Carlo, was not. Carlo was 32, ambitious, ruthless, and smart enough to know that expanding into America required more than muscle. It required legitimacy. It required the appearance of respectability. It required the church. And so Salvatore made a proposal. He asked Benedetta to go with Carlo, to establish a presence in Chicago, to serve the family there as she had served them in Sicily, to be their spiritual anchor, their moral compass, their bridge to the divine. Benedetta agreed, not because Salvatore asked, but because she believed it was God's will. She arrived in Chicago in the summer of 1950. The city was boiling. Heat rose in waves from the pavement. The air smelled like stockyards and diesel in the lake. She wore her habit, black and white and severe, and she carried a single suitcase containing her Bible, her rosary, and a small wooden box lined with velvet. Inside the box were 3 vials of holy oil, consecrated by a bishop in Rome who had no idea what they would be used for. Carlo had arranged for her to stay at a convent on the south side, a place called St. Adalbert's. It was a Polish parish, working class, the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew everyone and strangers were noticed. But a nun was not a stranger. A nun was invisible. A nun could move through the world without suspicion, without scrutiny. A nun could carry messages, hold meetings, provide cover. The Mother Superior at St. Adalbert's was a woman named Sister Teresa. She was 60 years old, pragmatic, and not particularly curious about why a Sicilian nun had suddenly joined her community. She'd been told that Benedetta was there to help with the parish school, to teach catechism, to assist with the sick, and that's what Benedetta did. During the day. At night, she did something else. Carlo had brought 6 men with him from Sicily. Young men, loyal men, men who'd grown up in the family and understood the code. They set up operations quickly. They established connections with the existing Italian syndicates in Chicago, negotiated territories, arranged tributes, and when negotiations failed, when someone needed to be reminded of the consequences of disrespect, they came to Benedetta. The first time it happened was in October 1950. A man named Vito Castellano, a small-time operator who ran numbers on the west side, had refused to pay tribute to Carlo's crew. He'd laughed when they approached him. He'd told them to go back to Sicily, that Chicago had its own rules, its own families, and he didn't answer to some fresh-off-the-boat caphone who thought he could walk in and start collecting. Carlo didn't argue. He didn't threaten. He simply nodded and left. That night, one of his men, a young soldato named Enzo Mariani, came to St. Adalbert's. He knocked on the side door of the rectory, the door that led to the basement. Benedetta was waiting. She led him down the narrow stairs to the small chapel in the basement, a space used for private prayer and meditation. She'd already prepared. Candles were lit. The smell of incense hung in the air. On the altar, covered with a white cloth, was Enzo's gun. He knelt. Not in front of the altar, but in front of her. She placed her hand on his head. She asked him if he understood what he was about to do. If he understood that taking a life was a grave responsibility, a burden that would mark his soul. He said yes. He said he understood. She asked him if the man he was going to kill deserved to die. If his death would serve a higher purpose, would maintain order, would prevent greater chaos. Enzo hesitated. Then he said yes. He said Vito Castellano was a man without honor, a man who threatened the family, and the family was sacred. Benedetta nodded. She walked to the altar. She unwrapped the gun. She took one of the vials of holy oil and anointed the barrel, making the sign of the cross. She recited a prayer, the prayer for the anointing of the sick, the prayer that prepares the soul for death. Then she handed the gun back to Enzo. She looked into his eyes, and she said, "Requiescat in pace." Rest in peace. Vito Castellano was found the next morning in an alley behind his social club. Single gunshot to the head. Clean. Professional. The police investigated, but no one talked. No one had seen anything. The case went cold within a week. And in the basement of St. Adalbert's, Benedetta opened her ledger. She wrote the date. She wrote Vito's name. She wrote the amount of tribute he'd refused to pay. And beside his name, she wrote, "Requiescat in pace." This happened 42 more times over the next 4 years, not every week, not even every month, but regularly enough that it became a ritual, a sacrament. The men in Carlo's crew began to see Benedetta not as a nun, but as something more, a priestess, a conduit to divine authority. They believed that if she blessed their weapons, if she sanctioned their actions, then they were not murderers. They were soldiers in a holy war. And Benedetta believed it too. She kept meticulous records. In her ledger, she didn't just record names and dates. She recorded reasons, justifications. She wrote about men who'd betrayed the family, who'd stolen, who'd violated the code. She wrote about maintaining order, about preventing chaos, about serving a higher purpose. She wrote as if she were keeping accounts for God Himself. The men who came to her began to change. They became more disciplined, more controlled. They stopped the random violence, the drunken brawls, the petty cruelties that had marked the old ways, because Benedetta made them accountable. She made them justify every act of violence. She made them confess their intentions and their doubts. And if she judged them unworthy, if she believed they were acting out of greed or pride or simple cruelty, she refused to bless them. It only happened twice. Twice men came to her seeking her blessing, and she turned them away. She told them their cause was not righteous, that what they intended was murder, not correction, that they would have to answer to God without her intercession. Both men ignored her. Both went ahead with their plans, and both were dead within a month. One killed by rivals, one killed by his own crew, who saw his disobedience to Benedetta as a betrayal of the family itself. After that, no one disobeyed her. Carlo Russo watched all of this with a mixture of admiration and unease. He'd brought Benedetta to Chicago because he thought she would provide cover, legitimacy, a veneer of respectability. What he hadn't anticipated was that she would become the moral center of his operation, that his men would defer to her not out of fear but out of genuine belief, that she would wield more authority than he did, not through violence but through faith. He began to wonder if he'd made a mistake, if he'd given her too much power, if she was controlling him rather than the other way around. In the spring of 1953, he decided to test her. There was a man named James Sullivan, an Irish cop who worked the South Side. Sullivan was on Carlo's payroll, had been for 2 years. He provided protection, advance warning of raids, information about rival operations. But recently, Sullivan had become greedy. He'd started demanding more money. He'd started making threats. He'd told Carlo that if the payments didn't increase, he'd start talking to the feds. Carlo wanted Sullivan dead. But Sullivan was a cop. Killing a cop brought heat, attention, federal investigations. It was a line that most families didn't cross unless absolutely necessary. Carlo went to Benedetta. He laid out the situation. He asked for her blessing. She refused. She told him that killing a police officer, even a corrupt one, would bring consequences that outweighed the benefit, that it would destabilize the careful balance they'd maintained, that there were other ways to handle the situation. Carlo argued. He told her that Sullivan was a threat, that he couldn't be trusted, that letting him live was a risk they couldn't afford. Benedetta didn't raise her voice. She simply said, "No." Carlo left. He was furious. He felt undermined, emasculated. He considered going ahead without her blessing. But he knew that if he did, if he acted against her judgment, he would lose the loyalty of his men. They believed in her. They trusted her, more than they trusted him. So he found another way. He had Sullivan transferred. He used his connections in the police department to get Sullivan reassigned to a different precinct, far from Carlo's territory. And he made sure that Sullivan understood the message. Take the transfer and keep quiet, or face consequences that had nothing to do with Benedetta's blessing. Sullivan took the transfer, and Carlo realized something that chilled him. Benedetta wasn't just providing spiritual cover for his operations. She was controlling them. She had become the final authority, the arbiter of life and death. And he, Carlo Russo, capo of the Chicago crew, answered to a nun. He began to resent her, but he also began to fear her, because he understood, in a way he hadn't before, that faith was a more powerful weapon than any gun, that men who believed they were doing God's work would endure things that ordinary criminals would not, that Benedetta had created something more dangerous than a crime family. She'd created a cult. And then, in the fall of 1954, everything unraveled. It started with a man named Anthony Greco. Greco was a soldato in a rival crew, a group that operated out of the north side and had been encroaching on Carlo's territory. There had been tensions for months, small skirmishes, threats, but nothing that couldn't be managed through negotiation. Then Greco made a mistake. He killed one of Carlo's men. Not in a fight, not in self-defense. He ambushed him outside a restaurant, shot him in the back, and left him bleeding on the sidewalk. Carlo wanted immediate retaliation. He wanted Greco dead. And he went to Benedetta. She listened. She asked questions. She asked if Greco's death would end the conflict or escalate it. She asked if there were other options, other ways to respond that wouldn't lead to a war. Carlo didn't want to hear it. He told her that this was different, that this was a matter of honor, of respect, of showing strength, that if he didn't respond, he would look weak, that his crew would lose faith in him. Benedetta was silent for a long time. Then she said, "Bring me Greco's name, his full name, his history, everything you know about him. I will pray on it." Carlo left. He was confident she would agree. This was clear-cut. This was justified. This was exactly the kind of situation where her blessing made sense. But when he returned 2 days later, Benedetta refused. She told him that Greco's death would start a war, that the North Side crew would retaliate, that innocent people would die, that the police would be forced to intervene, that everything they'd built, the careful structure, the disciplined operation, would collapse. She told him to negotiate, to find a peaceful resolution, to accept a tribute, a payment, some form of restitution that would satisfy honor without spilling more blood. Carlo exploded. He shouted at her. He told her she didn't understand how this world worked, that she was a woman, a nun, sheltered and naive, that he'd made a mistake bringing her to Chicago, giving her authority she didn't deserve. Benedetta didn't respond. She simply looked at him with those dark, calm eyes, and she said, "If you kill Greco without my blessing, you do so alone, and you will answer to God without my intercession." Carlo stormed out. He was done. He was finished taking orders from a nun. He would handle this himself. That night, he sent 2 of his men to kill Anthony Greco. He didn't tell them to go to Benedetta first. He didn't ask for her blessing. He simply gave the order. The men hesitated. They asked if Sister Benedetta had sanctioned it. Carlo told them she had. He lied. They went. They found Greco at a bar on the north side. They waited until he left, followed him to his car, and shot him 4 times. He died before the ambulance arrived. The North Side crew retaliated within 48 hours. They hit one of Carlo's social clubs, killed 2 men, wounded 3 others. Carlo responded. The North Side responded again. Within a week, 7 people were dead. The police launched a major investigation. The FBI got involved, and the careful, disciplined operation that Carlo and Benedetta had built began to crumble. Benedetta knew immediately that Carlo had lied. She knew because the men who'd killed Greco came to her afterward, seeking absolution. They knelt in the basement chapel, their hands shaking, and they confessed. They told her that Carlo had said she'd blessed the hit, that they'd believed him. She didn't absolve them. She told them they'd been deceived, that they'd acted without divine sanction, that their souls were in jeopardy. The men were devastated. One of them, a young soldato named Paolo, broke down. He wept. He said he'd trusted Carlo, trusted the family, trusted that what they were doing was righteous, and now he didn't know what to believe. Benedetta placed her hand on his head. She told him that faith required discernment, that obedience to men was not the same as obedience to God, that he would have to choose. Paolo left the chapel, and 3 days later, he walked into the FBI field office in Chicago and started talking. He told them everything, about Carlo's crew, about the operations, about the killings, and about the nun who blessed the guns. The FBI didn't believe him at first. It sounded insane. A Catholic nun sanctifying mob hits? But Paolo was specific. He gave them dates, names, locations. He told them about the basement chapel at St. Adalbert's. He told them about the ledger. The FBI got a warrant. On November 3rd, 1954, they raided the rectory. They found the false panel. They found the room. They found the ledger and the guns and the vials of holy oil. And they found Benedetta. She was in the main chapel, kneeling in prayer. She didn't resist. She didn't run. When the agents approached her, she simply stood, smoothed her habit, and asked if she could finish her rosary. They let her. Then they arrested her. The trial was a media sensation. The newspapers called her the mob nun, the angel of death, the sister of sin. They published photographs of her being led into court in handcuffs, her face calm, her eyes downcast. They published excerpts from the ledger, the names of the dead, the prayers she'd written beside each entry. The prosecution argued that Benedetta was a co-conspirator in 43 murders, that she'd provided material support to a criminal enterprise, that she'd used her position as a nun to give legitimacy to violence. The defense argued that she was delusional, that she'd been manipulated by Carlo Russo and his crew, that she genuinely believed she was doing God's work, and that belief, however misguided, negated criminal intent. Benedetta herself said almost nothing. She answered questions when asked, but she didn't defend herself. She didn't express remorse. When the prosecutor asked her if she understood that blessing guns used to kill people was wrong, she said, "I understand that you believe it is wrong. When he asked her if she felt any guilt for the deaths of 43 people, she said, "I feel sorrow for all death, but I do not feel guilt for maintaining order in a fallen world." The jury deliberated for 6 days. They found her guilty on 3 counts of conspiracy to commit murder. The judge sentenced her to 25 years in federal prison. Carlo Russo was never charged. He disappeared 2 weeks before the trial began. Rumor was he'd fled back to Sicily, that the family had pulled him out to avoid the publicity. Paolo, the soldato who'd turned informant, entered witness protection. He died in 1967, reportedly of a heart attack, though some believed it was something else. Benedetta served 18 years. She was a model prisoner. She attended Mass every day in the prison chapel. She taught literacy classes to other inmates. She never spoke about the case, never gave interviews, never sought early release. In 1972, she was paroled. She was 63 years old. The church had defrocked her years earlier, quietly, without public announcement. She was no longer Sister Mary Benedetta. She was just Benedetta Russo. She returned to Sicily, to the village of Corleone, to the house where she'd been born. Her uncle Salvatore was long dead. The old mafia families had been weakened by prosecutions and internal wars. The world she'd known had changed. She lived alone. She attended Mass at the village church, sitting in the back, never taking communion. The priest, a young man who didn't know her history, tried to speak with her once. He asked if she needed confession, if she wanted to reconcile with the church. She smiled, that same rare smile, and she said, "I have nothing to confess." She died in 1989 at the age of 80, a quiet death, a private funeral. She was buried in the village cemetery in an unmarked grave. The ledger is still in evidence storage in Chicago. 43 names, 43 entries, 43 times she wrote requiescat in pace, beside the record of a death she'd sanctioned. Investigators who've studied the case still argue about what Benedetta really was. Was she a true believer who'd convinced herself that murder could be holy? Was she a manipulator who used faith as a weapon? Was she mentally ill, delusional, unable to distinguish between divine will and her own desires? Or was she something else entirely? Something more disturbing? A woman who understood, better than most, that faith and violence have always been partners, that the church has blessed armies and crusades and inquisitions for centuries, that the only difference between a holy war and a gang war is who writes the history. There's a detail that didn't come out during the trial, something the FBI found but never made public. In the back of Benedetta's ledger, on the last page, she'd written a single sentence in Latin, a quote from Augustine, "Diligio et quod vis fac," love and do what you will. It's a line often misunderstood. Augustine meant that if you truly love God, if your heart is aligned with divine will, then whatever you do will be righteous. Your actions will be sanctified by the purity of your love. But it can also mean something darker. It can mean that love, or what we call love, can justify anything. That if we believe deeply enough, if we're certain enough of our righteousness, we can transform any act, no matter how brutal, into something sacred. Benedetta believed she loved God. She believed she was serving a higher order, and that belief allowed her to bless 43 murders without ever questioning whether she might be wrong. The men who came to her, who knelt in that basement chapel and received her blessing, they believed too. They believed that a nun's prayers could transform them from killers into crusaders, that holy oil on a gun barrel could sanctify the bullet, that requiescat in pace spoken over a corpse could grant absolution. And maybe that's the most terrifying thing about this story. Not that Benedetta was evil, but that she was sincere, that she genuinely believed she was doing God's work, that she created a system where murder became sacrament, where violence became prayer, where men could kill and still consider themselves righteous. Because if faith can do that, if belief can be weaponized so completely that it erases the boundary between good and evil, then what does that say about faith itself? What does it say about the human capacity for self-deception? What does it say about the systems we build, the rituals we perform, the authorities we defer to? The basement chapel at St. Adalbert's was sealed after the trial. The archdiocese wanted to demolish it, to erase any trace of what had happened there. But the building was old, structurally sound, and expensive to tear down. So they just locked the door, painted over it, pretended it didn't exist, but it's still there. Behind the false panel, the small room where Benedetta performed her rituals, where she anointed guns with holy oil, where she transformed killers into believers, the candles are gone. The altar is gone. The vials of holy oil were destroyed as evidence. But if you stand in that room, if you close your eyes and breathe in the stale air, you can still smell it. Faint, almost imaginary. The ghost of frankincense and gun oil. And you can still feel the question that room asks. The question Benedetta's entire life asks. How does a person convince themselves that murder is holy? How does faith become so absolute that it erases morality? How does a nun, a bride of Christ, a woman who took vows of poverty and chastity and obedience, become the spiritual architect of 43 deaths? And how many other Benedettas are out there right now, in different forms, in different systems, convincing themselves and others that cruelty is righteousness, that violence is love, that the ends justify any means as long as you frame them correctly? The ledger sits in evidence storage. 43 names, 43 deaths, 43 times she wrote Requiescat in pace. Rest in peace. But there is no peace. Not for the dead, not for the living, not for anyone who looks too closely at what Benedetta created and recognizes the machinery of belief that allowed it to exist. Because that machinery is still running, still converting faith into violence, still blessing bullets, still whispering that if you believe deeply enough, if you're certain enough, if you love God enough, then anything you do in His name is sanctified. And the question remains, can a person serve both God and the devil? Or is the devil just what we call God when we finally see what faith, untempered by doubt, is truly capable of? Benedetta never answered that question. She died believing she'd served righteously, believing she'd maintained order, believing that every name in that ledger, every death she'd sanctioned, was justified. Maybe she was right. Maybe in some twisted geometry of faith, she was doing exactly what she believed God wanted. Or maybe she was just a woman who found a way to make murder feel holy. Who discovered that if you wrap violence in ritual, if you frame killing as sacrament, people will believe. They'll kneel. They'll confess. They'll accept your blessing and go out into the night with sanctified weapons and sanctified intentions. And they'll kill. And they'll call it righteousness. The truth, like so much about Benedetta's story, remains ambiguous, unresolved, a question rather than an answer. 43 names, 43 deaths, 43 blessings. Requiescat in pace. But whose peace, and at what cost?